a legendary king of the Crusades, once shared a bed with the very man considered England's greatest rival. Sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? They called him Richard the Lionheart, heart of a lion, hand of God, the king who shattered Jerusalem's gates and made all of Europe tremble. But before he rode into battle, before he ever swore an oath to God, Richard lay in the same bed as Philip II of France and declared it an unbreakable alliance. That night, the two most powerful men in Europe dined together, toasted one another, and rested their heads on the same mattress. No scribes, no servants, just two hearts, two colossal egos, and one secret that was never fully confessed. But this isn't just a story about one night. It's a question that has whispered across 8 centuries. Did England's greatest warrior king live a life no one dared to name? And if he did, we may need to rewrite what we mean by masculinity, what we call heroism, and what we expect from a king. But before we answer that, you need to hear about the strangest confession ever whispered inside a pope's private chamber. Because that is where Richard began to hint at what no one dared to say. Are you ready? This isn't a history lesson. It's a journey into the soul beneath the golden armor of a king who never bowed. Rome, 1195. In the dim light of a candle, barely clinging to life, a cloaked figure knelt before the confessional. The marble beneath his knees was cold, and the shadows of saints carved along the wall seemed to lean in closer. The man was not a monk nor a penitent pilgrim. He was a king, Richard I of England, the Lionheart, the hammer of the Saracens, the icon of Christian knighthood, had come to confess. His words were quiet, but what he said chilled the air like steel drawn from a scabbard. I have committed carnal sins. He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. The phrase itself carried weight: sins, not of violence or pride, but of the body. The Pope heard him, and history too was listening. Richard's life had been a parade of battlefield triumphs, of banners raised over conquered lands. He was revered, feared, exalted. But beneath the chainmail and the Crusader's cross lived a man, flesh and want. Longings never sung about in ballads, never carved into stone. What sins did he mean? Was it lust for a woman during his holy war, a servant in the shadows of Acre? Or, as many have long whispered, was it something far more scandalous? Not a woman, but a man, a fellow king. Some said he confessed only because death had once brushed his shoulder, the fever that nearly claimed him after the Third Crusade. Others believed the guilt ran deeper, knotted around a truth no crown could bury. The church accepted his confession, but it never named the sin, and that silence, that hollow in the archive, became the echo where speculation thrived. Outside the chamber, bells rang across the Vatican rooftops, but inside Richard rose without a word. The candle flickered one last time and went out. He would soon return to France, and within days, he would once again stand side by side with Philip II, the King of France, the very man who once shared not just his table, but his bed. Paris, 1187. The halls of the Capuchin court echoed with laughter and spilled wine. Outside, the streets hummed with tension. France and England were never truly at peace, but inside, a celebration unfolded that defied history itself. Richard Plantagenet, Prince of England and Duke of Aquitaine, stood shoulder to shoulder with Philip II, King of France. Not as enemies, not as rivals, but as allies, brothers, and some whispered something more. In front of the French court, they swore oaths of eternal loyalty. They dined side by side, toasted from the same cup, and according to more than one chronicler, retired to the same bed. Yes, the same bed. Now, in medieval diplomacy, sharing a bed wasn't uncommon. Kings and nobles often did so as a symbolic gesture to display trust, to show there were no hidden daggers between them. But this wasn't any ordinary peace offering. It wasn't just ceremony, because Richard and Philip didn't share a bed for one night. They shared it for months. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to explain it. Roger of Hoveden, an English historian, described the scene with unease. They ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them. This was not how kings behaved, not in public, not in papal Europe, not unless something was being silently, powerfully said. Philip was young, calculating, politically astute. Richard was passionate, proud, and deeply aware of optics. Together, they made a striking image, one that blurred the line between alliance and affection. The French court began to murmur. Was this the birth of a unified empire, or the beginning of a scandal that even God himself would struggle to forgive? Their bond bore political fruit. The Anglo-French alliance briefly threatened the balance of Europe. Even Richard's father, Henry II, grew wary, accusing Philip of bewitching his son. And when that alliance turned on him, it was Philip who backed Richard in open rebellion. But the deeper question remains, did Richard love Philip? Were they simply forging a pact of iron and blood? Or was there something underneath, something unspeakable in their time? Even today, scholars remain divided. Some argue the bed sharing was symbolic. Others point to the intimate tone of their correspondence, the jealousy that later crept into Philip's actions, the passion with which Richard defied his own father for Philip's favor. History loves Richard the Lionheart, but it rarely knows how to love him back. When chroniclers wrote of his valor, they were certain. When they etched his victories into stone, they left no doubt. But when it came to his heart, to who he trusted, to who he may have loved, their pens hesitated. And that hesitation is where this chapter lives. Roger of Hoveden, an English chronicler writing in the king's own lifetime, describes something that doesn't quite fit into the tidy image of medieval masculinity. Not just shared beds, but shared meals from the same dish, days spent side by side, and nights inseparable. Another source, the Norman monk Ralph of Decerto, noted the unusual closeness between Richard and Philip, describing a bond that astonished even the courtiers. It was not just political, not just fraternal, it was, their words, singular. Now, historians will tell you the Middle Ages were not our modern world. Expressions of male intimacy, even deep physical closeness, did not always imply sexuality. Brothers kissed cheeks. Knights wept together in each other's arms. Sharing a bed wasn't necessarily scandalous. But this wasn't a knight and his comrade. This was two monarchs, two rulers, two symbols of Christian manhood and sovereignty. And they chose repeatedly to be seen in the soft glow of candlelight behind the same velvet drapes. Their closeness was so intense, so public, that it ignited unease even in their own courts. Henry II. Richard's father accused Philip of bewitching his son. One French chronicler called their relationship a fire too bright to last. Was it a tactical alliance, a manipulative entanglement, or something more sincere and far more dangerous? Two kings beneath a canopy of silk, whispering strategies between bites of roasted pheasant. One smiles, the other watches, eyes darker than the wine in their goblets. The room falls silent, not because of what they say, but because of what they don't. Modern scholars have tried to draw lines. Was it bromance, the deep fraternal bond forged through politics and war? Or was it romance, a relationship that dared to tiptoe into forbidden ground? The truth is, we don't have the letters. We don't have the bedroom keys. But we have the reaction, and sometimes that tells us everything. Powerful men only inspire this kind of fear when they're crossing a line. And perhaps the line wasn't in the bed, but in the hearts of those who watched, terrified that love might disrupt the order of crowns. He wore a crown. He led armies across continents. He conquered fortresses, crossed deserts, and carved his name into the bones of history. But Richard the Lionheart, King of England, hero of Christendom, left behind no heir. Not a single child, not even a whisper of one. In 1191, under the hot Cypriot sun, Richard married Berengaria of Navarre. It was a royal match, respectable, well-timed, politically safe. She arrived in a veil of white silk. He stood in gleaming armor. But their union felt more like a treaty than a vow. They spent their wedding night apart. Most royal couples, even the loveless ones, did their duty. Heirs were not optional. Dynasties depended on them, but Richard and Berengaria would remain apart for most of their marriage. She rarely saw him. He never returned to her, and the English people never saw a prince born of their king. Chroniclers noticed, whispers began. Was it sterility? Was it strategy? Was it sin? The absence of heirs wasn't just a personal mystery, it was a political risk. Richard's younger brother John, ambitious, cunning, waited in the wings. The lack of a clear successor would plunge the Plantagenet line into turmoil after Richard's death. And yet, the king seemed unmoved. No mistresses, no bastards, no secret children tucked away in countryside castles. Nothing, only Berengaria, alone, distant, increasingly irrelevant. Some argue that Richard was simply too devoted to war, that the battlefield was his mistress, his battlefield victories, his legacy. But others believe something deeper or quieter was at work, that he married because he had to, that he ruled because he must. But when it came to desire, his heart lived elsewhere, and perhaps in that silence he said more than history ever could. He was the embodiment of holy war, the lion banner of Christendom, the one who stormed the gates of Acre, who stood atop mountains of slain infidels, and raised his sword to the sky, not for glory but for God. Richard the Lionheart was a crusader in every sense of the word. And yet, he may have carried into battle a secret that clashed with everything the cross was said to stand for. The church hailed him as their champion. He was excommunicated and then forgiven, condemned and then exalted. But buried beneath that sacred armor was a man who had once knelt before the Pope and confessed sins of the flesh. And many now believe those sins were not committed with women. There is a line between faith and self. For most it is narrow, for kings it is thinner still. How did Richard reconcile the weight of the cross on his chest with the weight of a desire the church had no place for? Historians have tried to explain it away. Some claim his confession was about lust in general or a moment of weakness during campaign. Others suggest political pressures forced him to purge his soul before reclaiming royal legitimacy. But what if it was sincere? What if the man who led the armies of God carried into battle the guilt of loving the wrong person? Richard's legend was carved by men who needed saints, not contradictions. But contradictions are what make humans real. He was a warrior and a king. He may also have been a man who loved men. And somehow, impossibly, he was still chosen by Christendom as its sword. This isn't just about one man. It's about how history treats difference, how it scrubs softness from strong men, how it rewrites stories to make the saints more convenient. But sometimes, the holiness of a life doesn't come from its purity. It comes from its struggle to live truthfully within its chains. Before Richard was crowned, before he wielded a sword in the Holy Land, or stood beside a foreign king in the hush of candlelight, he was simply the son of a woman who had already ruled empires. Eleanor of Aquitaine was unlike any woman of her time, or perhaps of any time. She had worn 2 crowns, raised 10 children, survived imprisonment, and outmaneuvered kings. She had ridden into battle, debated bishops, and once charmed an entire court into war. If power had a human form in the 12th century, it looked like her. And if there was anyone who understood the silence behind her son's golden armor, it was her. Eleanor had lived long enough to know that kings did not always marry for love. She herself had not. She knew that desire could be dangerous, but denial could be fatal. She also knew her son, and she had read every line of every letter that passed through her court. When Richard wrote to Philip of France in words warmer than diplomacy required, Eleanor did not flinch. When rumors drifted from Paris that the 2 kings shared more than wine and strategy, she listened but said nothing. She did not need confirmation. She had seen too much of the world to need it. Years before, Eleanor had stood beside her own uncle in Antioch and faced the same kind of whispers that now followed her son. She had known longing behind walls of duty. She had tasted the cost of stepping outside the lines. And so when Richard prepared to wed Berengaria, a woman he would rarely see again, Eleanor made the arrangements. She negotiated the dowry, organized the ceremony, and did what queens were expected to do. But she did not expect the marriage to matter. She knew it was only a veil, one more layer between Richard and a world that would never fully accept the truth of him. Eleanor protected more than Richard's crown. She protected the spaces in which he could be whole, not just as a soldier or a king, but as a man who perhaps loved in a way the church could not bless. She never spoke publicly about what she may have known, but she did not need to. Her silence was armor. Her gaze was shield enough. And her legacy, though rarely written in these words, may be that she was the first to understand him without needing to ask. History often forgets women who choose to keep secrets, but Eleanor didn't forget. She remembered everything. And she may have been the only one who ever saw Richard not as the Lionheart, but as a son. A sword can do more than cleave flesh. Handled by the right hand, it can carve absence, paring away the soft edges of a story until only the gleaming blade remains. That is what happened to Richard I. When medieval clerks first copied the chronicles, they preserved the puzzling lines: Richard and Philip shared one bed, Roger of Howden wrote unable or unwilling to explain why. The parchment survived. The words faint but intact waited for the eyes of later centuries. Then the sword went to work. Victorian editors polishing the legend for polite society found the sentence disquieting. They filed its edge smooth. In an 1841 biography, the phrase bedfellow is replaced by a typographical dash, an elegant wound, where truth once stood. The reader sees nothing but white space and moves on. And so from drawing room to classroom, the dash became doctrine. Heroes must be simple. Kings especially must be straight. Silence travels well. By the time Hollywood re-enlisted Richard in the Crusades, 1935, the script had no room for warm letters to a French monarch, no time for an English queen left alone with an empty crib. It needed trumpets, not subtext. A silver-screen Lionheart rode across Palestine, radiant and uncomplicated, exactly the man a mid-century audience expected him to be. But the camera cannot erase what the archive whispers. Walk into the British Library today and ask to see Cotton MS, Vespasian a Sift Townend. Press your fingertips carefully over the vellum. You will feel a roughness where medieval ink once spelled out a relationship too intimate for politics alone. Someone centuries later scraped the surface with a penknife. Under raking light, you can still glimpse the ghost of the sentence, like a scar after poorly healed surgery. That knife left nothing for us to read, yet everything for us to suspect. Erasure rarely stops at one border. In classical studies, Alexander rules without Hephaestion's kisses. In American civics, Lincoln shares a narrow boarding house bed with Joshua Speed only because lodgings were scarce. Each explanation passes down like a family recipe for denial, seasoned, reheated, served to the next generation. What do we lose when we swallow it? We lose Richard's loneliness on Crusade nights, writing to a man who once slept beside him. We lose Philip's jealousy when political debts replaced whispered confidences. We lose Berengaria's quiet grief as she waits in Aquitaine for a husband who will never return to her arms or her bed. We do not simply lose gossip. We lose the small human hinges on which history actually turns. Yet silence is never perfect. It rings like a struck bell, with the shape of what is missing. Modern scholars trace the vibrations. Queer readers pick up the echo. Filmmakers bolder now allow a lingering glance between Richard and Philip, a deliberate tension in a line delivery. Each act restores a syllable the sword once is sliced away, and the legend, unstable alive, begins to breathe differently. So the question is no longer whether Richard loved a man or two or none. The question is, why were we taught not to ask? What empire was served by keeping the pillow of a king forever cold and solitary in the records? Who profits when complexity is trimmed from courage, when intimacy is severed from power? 1,000 years ago, a chronicler wrote the truth in plain Latin. 100 years ago, an editor replaced it with a dash. Today, we tilt the manuscript to the light and watch the erased letters flicker back like embers. The silence of the sword is ending. History is not carved in stone. It's recast, rewritten, reperformed each generation, reshaping legends in its own image. Richard the Lionheart, once preserved in stained glass, and royal tapestries, has lived a second life far from the dust of manuscripts. He has walked across movie sets, stood beneath theater lights, and flickered into being through the lens of storytellers unafraid to ask, what if the rumors were true? In 1935, Hollywood gave us a version of Richard wrapped in white armor and divine righteousness. Cecil B. DeMille's The Crusades framed him as a pure-hearted warrior, battling Muslims abroad and royal duty at home. There was no room for nuance, no mention of shared beds or private letters. The Richard on screen was chiseled noble and unmistakably heterosexual. He was not a man who confessed sins of the flesh. He was not a man who once called another king his beloved. But the story began to shift. In 1968, The Lion in Winter introduced a different kind of Richard, wounded, guarded, and complicated. Anthony Hopkins played him not as a holy knight, but as a son scarred by politics and perhaps something more intimate. In a quiet exchange with his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, he admits to having loved someone once. He says no name. He doesn't have to. The pause is everything. By the time Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves reached audiences in 1991, Richard had become myth once more, this time in the brief, shining form of Sean Connery. He arrives on horseback, smiles benevolently, gives away a bride, and says almost nothing at all. His legacy is ceremonial, sterile, almost divine. But between these extremes, the silent icon and the aching sun, a new space was forming. Modern retellings, especially on stage and in independent film, have dared to say what the old chronicles only implied. They place Richard and Philip side by side, not as mere allies, but as lovers. They let the bed sharing become emotional, not just political. Some present Richard's marriage to Berengaria as camouflage. Others paint Eleanor as the knowing protector of a son whose private life was too dangerous to name. And beyond the screen in essays, lectures, and forums, LGBTQ historians have begun reclaiming Richard not as proof, but as possibility. They do not argue that he must have been gay. They argue that it is valid to wonder, valid to read the text differently, valid to imagine a king whose courage included the strength to love someone history didn't approve of. Somewhere in a small theater in London, a play retells the Crusades not through battles, but through love letters between two monarchs. The audience leans forward in silence as Richard kneels beside a dying Philip, whispering the words he never dared write. On the wall behind them, projections flicker actual quotes from medieval chroniclers, preserved across centuries. Pop culture has not replaced history, but it has helped complete it. It gives us a Lionheart who bleeds, who doubts, who desires, and who may have carried more than a sword into battle, perhaps also a secret, perhaps also a loss. Imagine the scene differently. No scribe erases the line. No penknife scrapes the vellum. The Latin remains intact, and at night their beds did not divide them. The phrase travels intact through centuries, printed in every chronicle, taught in every classroom, repeated from pulpit to playground, until it slips from curiosity to common knowledge. What changes? First, the battlefield. Picture Richard and Philip riding shoulder to shoulder at the Siege of Acre, not merely allies of necessity, but partners whose shared heartbeat drums beneath chainmail. The banner of England cracks in the desert wind beside the fleur-de-lis, and soldiers see something startling in that unity, an intimacy fiercer than rivalry, deeper than treaty. Would they fight harder, believing their leaders bled for each other as well as for God? Or would whispers of unnatural love rot the army's spine? History does not give us the answer, but it lets us ask the question. Then the court. A queen without heirs becomes not a mystery, but a deliberate arrangement. Berengaria honored for statecraft, while the king's devotion lies elsewhere. Eleanor of Aquitaine need not guard secrets in ash and fire. She may raise a toast instead, declaring that courage wears many faces. A mother's love is no less fierce for being honest. What if medieval Europe, seeing its mightiest warrior unashamed, discovered that masculinity could flex without breaking, that the sword loses none of its edge when the hand gripping it is also capable of tenderness toward another man? 1,000 years later, the legends we inherit are different. Boys leafing through illustrated histories find footnotes that speak openly of desire and learn that valor is not the exclusive province of the straight. Girls too glimpse a world where power is negotiated rather than prescribed, where alliances of the heart alter empires as surely as alliances of blood. A queer reader once searching for fragments now meets a fully formed hero who mirrors their own pulse. The Lionheart becomes proof that greatness is not the reward for conformity, but the prize for audacity. Does it matter if the love was real? Yes, because possibility reshapes memory. When we permit the queerness that may have existed, we invite nuance back into the narrative. We rescue Richard from marble and let him breathe again, a man of prayer and appetite, of brutal genius and private longing. His victories do not dim, they gain dimension. His flaws do not vanish, they become human rather than mythic. And heroism itself tilts, accepting that a warrior can storm cities by day and write tender vows by night, that history can be both iron and silk. So let the question hang, not as accusation, but as invitation. What if he loved him? What other stories about triumph and tenderness, faith and flesh, wait between the lines of chronicles still sleeping in archives? Somewhere in the folds of time between fact and folklore, beneath the weight of chainmail and the hush of draped velvet, there is a bed. It once stood inside the palace at Paris, or perhaps in the stone fortress of Rouen. Or maybe it never stood at all, except in the margins of a monk's manuscript, in the memory of a forgotten attendant or in the kindling silence that trails all great secrets. But still the bed remains, not as a relic, but as a symbol, not just of two kings who may have shared it, but of the questions that refused to be buried with them. Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, shot by a crossbow bolt while laying siege to a small castle. It was not a heroic battlefield, not a clash of empires, just another ripple in the sea of ambition. He left behind no son, no written confession, no heir to carry his blood, only fragments. A marriage without intimacy, a mother who said little and burned much, and a French king who mourned him privately, though no eulogy was ever given. Yet the legend lived on. It lived in every statue raised without a heart. It lived in every textbook that praised his crusade, but skipped the chapter on his confessions. It lived in the silence between historians who knew and chose not to speak. It lived in the glances passed between actors playing Richard and Philip on a stage, too careful to name what the script only hints at. And still it lives. This isn't just Richard's story. It belongs to every truth carved too softly, every love written in disappearing ink, every legacy shaped by what could not be said aloud. Because history is not only what happened, it's what we choose to remember. And sometimes remembering is the most radical act of all. So let the bed remain not as scandal, but as testament. Let it remind us that greatness has always worn many faces, and some of the bravest hearts have beaten bodies that did not fit the mold of their time. Richard was a warrior, a king, a crusader, and perhaps he was also a man who loved. The chronicles may never give us the full truth, but the legacy whispered from scribe to screen lives on.